Thank you for watching. Prime Minister Mr. Narendra Modi will be making his first Independence Day speech in a couple of days. The Prime Minister has several major tasks aimed at overhauling the Indian economy, making it productive, vigorous, and above all, unleashing the animal spirits. Cronyism can corrode India. Cronyism will certainly be an extremely corrosive force that the Prime Minister will have to tackle. Ramachandran, otherwise known as Ramach, the Governor of the Reserve Bank of India, Dr. Raghuram Rajan, had made an emphatic statement on Monday, the 11th of August 2014, condemning cronyism. He's absolutely right. Cronyism is a potently destructive force that could derail India, destroy India's economy, and in the long term enfeeble it so much that we may actually have an enormous amount of contempt for the private sector. That could actually push us back into state ownership of assets. In the main, cronies are business people that extract advantages from the government, and these advantages are actually paid for by the commoners and other competing entrepreneurs. And invariably, they work in such spaces where the economic competition is of a low intensity. Therefore, what happens is they have price-setting power. The second advantage that cronies have is in privileged access to capital. Capital comprises both borrowed money or debt and equity from shareholders. Cronies have privileged access to banking credit. In the pricing of debt, we usually look at the benchmark cost of debt, which the Treasury or the government pays, plus a compensation for the credit risk of the borrower, which is usually known as a credit spread. Very frequently, banks overlook the credit quality of the borrower and they price the credit risk as low as possible, which means the lending rate to cronies is substantially lower. The banks choose to overlook the credit risk of cronies for two reasons. One, a crony works in uncontested market spaces. Therefore, the threat to revenues and profits is underestimated on purpose. The second part is banks usually are owned by the government, or they're part owned by government. Therefore, the decision-making apparatus within banks is usually told or influenced to look at a crony's credit risk at a lower level than what it would be had the bank operated in a fiercely competitive market space. The cronies have access to privileged equity too, very patient equity, and moreover, the equity investors in firms operated by cronies understand that somehow business cycles, the risk of business cycles will not touch these firms. Therefore, on a risk-adjusted basis, the required rate on equity too is suppressed. It's set at a very low level. Therefore, crony firms have a much lower weighted average cost of capital, which means what? Many projects in an economy that are actually unviable would be invested with crony money because the denominator would be low. Therefore, the present value of future cash flows would be very high. Therefore, unviable projects are usually invested in by cronies. They would show up to be unviable projects, and many of these projects would be abandoned halfway through, and that's what India has seen over the last 10 years. Many unviable projects were invested in by friends and cronies, and these projects are now stuck. Enormous sums of bank credit are stuck in these firms, and there's much frustration that the Reserve Bank of India has expressed in the recent past. That's not alone. When you have so much credit stuck with cronies, the banking sector would yet have to earn a normal rate of return that would pay for the cost of deposits. Therefore, viable projects could borrow or made to borrow at very high rates of return or interest rates. So there's a compensation that goes on within an economy. Cronies have access to privileged credit, privileged equity, and the very efficient, the very productive investors, entrepreneurs will have to pay higher rates of return, either on equity or on debt or on both, to compensate for the lower costs here. So the cost of capital to very productive firms is usually high, and the present value of their future cash flows would turn out to be low because they carry a bigger denominator. Therefore, non-cronies would put away projects because they would be unviable based on a risk-adjusted cost of debt, risk-adjusted cost of equity, and a weighted average cost of debt and equity put together. Which is why India has a humongous flow of bank credit into a whole lot of crony firms, and these massive sums of bank credit are stuck. The banking sector euphemistically calls these things non-performing assets. But to start with, these assets wouldn't have performed at all. In the main, what happens to non-crony firms is the numerator gets suppressed, the denominator gets inflated because there's greater credit risk associated with them. They are not cronies, and the business risk that a non-crony faces is also high. Therefore, the required rate of return on equity is also very high. So what happens is viable firms belonging to non-cronies are now orchestrated to look like non-viable or unviable firms. Therefore, they don't invest. So when you look at the three factors, an emaciated numerator for non-crony firms and an artificially inflated denominator, inflated in the sense the weighted average cost of capital would be inflated. Therefore, what happens is most non-crony firms will put away making investments because they would be found unviable. This is exactly what the governor has had to state, that firms in India are becoming risk averse, obviously because until now, risk was never considered part of the economic framework to assess projects. Cronyism has been pretty corrosive. We've pretended that it hasn't been. So the Prime Minister will have to ensure that the future of the Indian economy is not held captive by cronies. Who supports cronies? The government. Everyone would love to be a crony in India. India loves a whole bunch of cronies. But cronyism is practiced not by cronies but by government.